The first thing I want to know is you offer a service where you do a new business audit, and it includes a review of 3 key elements for your clients. 1 is their positioning, 2 is their service offering design, and 3 is their lead generation. And now, obviously, there are a million variables and you do a deep dive with clients and each case is unique. But I thought I'd be curious to hear, in general, your single best tip for each of these categories. So we'll take them one by one. Let's start with positioning. When someone comes to you and says, I want you to audit my business, I'm a consultant or I sell my expertise in some way. And what would sort of be your single best tip to them in terms of position?
Yeah. This is one where you almost have to answer that question based on where somebody is on their own journey, because in the early days, they build their firm, whether it's just them or other people too, they build their firm by saying yes a lot. And so they're always drawing an opportunity like a magnet, and they try to figure out what to do with it, how to make something out of it. But then they don't make that transition to a tighter positioning where they have to say no a lot. And so when I usually get them, they are right at that point where they realize they don't want to realize it. They know it's true, but it makes them uncomfortable. They're going to have to start saying no to a lot of things. But that feels terrifying to them because they're afraid they're not going to have enough work, right? So it's recognizing the fact that positioning is not about the work you say yes to. Positioning is more about the work that you say no to. And how do you get past that and thrive? So that would probably be the biggest thing I'd say.
That's great. And I've so found that for myself. I've been full-time sort of consulting on my own for about 6.5 years now. And yeah, at first it was like, oh, I can do that. I was saying yes to everything that I could do. Oh, you want Facebook ads? I could do Facebook ads for you. And eventually you sort of learn exactly what you were saying. Like, well, yeah, I could do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean I want to do it or it's the right fit. Along those lines, what advice would you have for somebody about how they figure out what to say no to?
So again, everybody has the right instinct here. They know what they should say no to. The reason they don't say no to it is because they don't have enough other opportunity lined up. They know the issue is not knowledge. The issue is the courage. And it's very hard to create enough courage unless you have something else you can say yes to. I find it very interesting. So there's one of these instincts we have as entrepreneurs that we can't say no to opportunity. It's almost like we have to stand in front of the mirror and practice our lips because we genetically can't say no. And so you have to think about, okay, what kind of courage am I going to need in order to say no to something else? But when you're crafting a positioning, you're not making something up. You're essentially looking at all of the possibilities. And sometimes there's just one, sometimes there's 3 or 4. And you're saying, now I'm going to focus on this. And nothing changes the next day. You're not all of a sudden smarter about this choice that you've made. What it is, a license to learn. So a positioning decision is saying, okay, from here forward, I am going to focus on something. I'm going to get better at what I do much quicker than I would have if I didn't. Because in the past, I just have to be good enough at all of these things. A positioning decision says, I'm going to start focusing here and get better at a much higher rate than I would otherwise.
Yeah, great. So let's go to the second thing you do in the new business audit. Let's talk about what would your single best tip be when it comes to service offering design? And maybe start by just explaining what you mean by service offering design for people who maybe aren't quite sure what that is.
Sure. So that service offering design relates to what you do for these clients that are best fit clients from a positioning standpoint. So the positioning question answers, who are your great clients? The service offering design question answers, what are you going to do for them? So I would say I'll give you the one tip, but I'll give you the 3 ways to think about service offering design. First is you need to have a fairly packaged way to start with clients. So when a prospect says, yeah, let's do this, you shouldn't have to think, oh, what do I do next? There should always be a regular way to start with a client. Second, and this is where this is the one big tip I would give you, is that whatever service offering design you offer to clients, whatever those choices are, most of your clients should use most of those services most of the time. So think of your service offering design menu, all the different 4 or 5 things you might do for them, as more of a fixed price menu where they just go through it step by step. Every once in a while, somebody skips the middle course or something, but most of the time. So then your service offering design question should reach all the way back to positioning, because you shouldn't even be taking on clients where you don't know what that decision path is going to look like. So the best tip there is construct your service offering design menu as a fixed price menu and not a buffet menu or a Cheesecake Factory menu where everybody's just choosing, because then you're just an order taker rather than guiding the relationship.
And along those lines, do you see that menu as something where the packages are uniquely different? So for example, one package is you get ABC service, the other package is you get DEF service, or is it package one is ABC, package two is ABC, DEF? Are you stacking, or are they alternate options, or does it matter?
You want to have certain modules of what you're really good at, and then you want to combine them in a way that's unique to you. So combine them in based on how you understand things to go. So I'm not going to work with a client long-term unless I always do a benchmarking first, because I want to know what we need to fix and how we're going to measure it as we fix it. So you're trying to put those things in place in a way that sometimes the client doesn't see it, but your positioning is not just about what you do for whom. Your positioning is also about how you do it. And that's where the service offering design comes in. So you could have two almost identically positioned firms, but the process of working with them should look very different. That's where the service offering design comes in, because you should have a perspective on how things should be solved and in what order, what goes next, and so on. So I think process is really important.
Yeah. Great. So now, obviously, with all of this, none of it works if you don't have lead coming in. So the third piece of your audit is the lead generation piece. So let's talk about that a bit. And what's your sort of best tip for lead generation?
Yeah. So lead gen starts by defining the target. So this is asking your teenage kid, what are the qualifications for somebody you might want to marry someday, right? Before they fall in love with that person. And so you have this very specific goal. So maybe that looks like, all right, they have to have used a firm like yours before, or like mine before. They need to be big enough, but not too big. They need to start with strategy. They need to have had budget allocated, even if they won't tell me how much it is. There needs to be some impending thing that means this is important to them, some event or some merger or whatever it is. So you define what your ideal client is, okay, so that you're not talking yourself out of this. Then you want to be very public about that, so public that imagine a prospect comes to your website and self-select themselves either in or out of the running before they ever speak to you. They ought to be so specific about what you're looking for in a client. And then you want to say, okay, based on all of this criteria, how many opportunities do I need in a year? And for a typical agency, they need to land a new client every 2 to 3 months. If it's big enough, that means they probably need to have 3 times that number of fantastic conversations. But whatever those lead gen choices are, they should flow from somebody who is viewed as an expert. Experts don't pick up the phone and cold call people normally. Every once in a while, they might do that. They don't send an employee out on the street with a sandwich board sign on. They are very much like your regular emails are not, they don't come across as Josh selling people. They're more like, here's something useful for you. And by the way, if you need more help, I'm sure you figured out that you could call me. That's more the feel of lead gen. So it's a long, slow, glorious play where you feel like you're helping all of these prospects, most of whom will never hire you, and you're totally fine with that.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you use my newsletter as an example. First of all, thank you for that. That's exactly how it has worked for me, right? My newsletter is the engine of my entire business. All my clients basically come through my newsletter or word of mouth from other clients who had come through the newsletter. And yet I hardly ever mention my services. The newsletter is not really, I'm not pitching my stuff all the time in the newsletter. And it does exactly what you said. It generates leads. But the other thing that's really interesting is I've noticed from very early on that a client who reads my newsletter becomes a way better client than someone who maybe hadn't read my newsletter. It becomes this filter because they get from reading my newsletter what I'm about, how I think about things, and we're way more likely to match than somebody who really didn't read my newsletter, but somebody recommended me to them and said, oh, go call Josh. And that can work as well. but it is interesting. I've noticed it works not only as lead generation, but a fantastic filter for who's going to be a good client and not. And I'm sure you find the same with your podcast and your books and everything else. There's one more thing about lead generation that I'd love if you could just talk about quickly. In your book, you talk about from the beginning, sort of identifying, is the market big enough or right sized for you? And I think you used a combination of numbers. Could you just talk a little about that, how you think about market size or how people can analyze that?
Yeah, because so you're going through this positioning exercise and you land on something that feels right. And then the next thing you do instinctively is, okay, is there anybody else out here who's going to be a competitor? You can't find one and you get all excited about, oh my God, we can own this thing. That should not be your response. Whatever your positioning option is, you should find at least a certain number of existing competitors, unless you're first to the market, but it's pretty unlikely. So around 10 is at least 10. And then you should find a certain amount of opportunity. So if you can't find at least a couple of thousand addressable prospects that need what this positioning promises, it's probably not going to be viable. Because in the professional services space, you can't assume you're going to lock up more than about 1% of the opportunity. So if there's 2,000 addressable prospects, that gives you 20 clients. You're going to cycle those over time. You might want to reach up to a higher 10,000 prospects, and you could have more than 10 competitors, but 10 competitors, 10,000 prospects, it's a beautiful picture right there. Yeah.
That's great. Cool.